Welcome to the Numbers Don't Tell Stories show. Each week, we like to give our listeners ideas on how to evaluate numbers through story. Our desire is to entertain you and provide you with useful insight. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're here for another episode of Numbers Don't Tell Stories. I'm Tom Etchison. That's Matthew Dix. We're your co-hosts for this endeavor. And thanks for coming back and giving us another shot, another listen here. And today we're going to do some work on something that's kind of interesting. It should give you some insight into us as human beings. And we're going to share numbers from a different perspective. Remember, this podcast is all about trying to be useful around numbers. We're presented with numbers all the time. We kind of bypass them. We overlook them because they don't have a lot of meaning. They're usually not well combined with a story or a framework. And so I came up with this concept of life by the numbers. Matthew has something that will link in the description, homework for life. He can explain a little bit of that, but it's this notion you should be thinking about and journaling and keeping track on a daily basis of things that impact you. And I found myself thinking about going back and reviewing my life by numbers and numbers that have impacted me throughout time. In fact, I'm going through and writing those down, and hopefully that's going to be a book someday. But the idea is that pick a number, and what does that mean? What was that a marker for? So we're going to start that. We're going to do a little work here. Matthew, I'll start off, and we'll see where this takes us here. So I'm reminded of the story of Jim Henson from the Muppets. When he was in school, they told him that puppeteering was really not, that wasn't a great career path. And so at some level, he was reading books on it and all these other things. And so he kind of gave up on it. And these voices kind of told him to stop pursuing that. And he ended up taking a trip to Europe where they actually took it very seriously, and he fell in love with it again. And the Muppets kind of came out of that. Well, for me, I remember very clearly back in late 1990 or early 1991, I had bought a word processor. And this was back in the day, back before computers and Microsoft Word and all the rest of that stuff. And this word processor had a little screen and a 3.5-inch display or a 3.5-inch disk where I could store everything off. And I thought it was the greatest thing in the world because I didn't have to worry about correction and all this other stuff. I could type it up, save it, and print it. It was amazing. This thing was a huge boat anchor, fold up, keyboard and all the rest of this stuff. But it quickly became not enough because I kept getting exposed to computers, whether it was at school or different places. And so I had typical, high school kid. I had after school jobs. I had a paper route. I've been saving up my money. And so I just started digging through the classified ads. So again, this is dating my whole thing, but I'm digging through the classified ads and I find an ad for a computer. And I have no business trying to evaluate the computer, whether it's good, bad, or any of these other things. You can't figure that out from the ad. There's no pictures.
And there's no internet to help you.
Right. There's no internet. There's no nothing. Right. So I'm just, like an old, just old fashioned looking through the classifieds. And so I call this number and ask him about the computer, pretending to know something. And they're like, giving me some information. I thought, well, this is as good as anything. And so I go to this house. Now, I have to talk my dad into taking me to this house. And he's totally non-committal about anything, could not be any less involved in the decision-making process. He was just there for transportation. And so I get to this house, go up to the door, knock on the door, and it's kind of this what I interpreted as a kid, as a middle-aged man living in this house with his parents. And he takes me in and shows me the computer, and we strike a deal, and I'm carting this thing, great big huge monitor, which wasn't huge at the time, but it was, heavy
Yeah.
and big CPU. Drag it out to my dad where he's waiting. He doesn't inquire what this thing is. He's not interested whatsoever. And so I take this thing home, I get it set up in my bedroom, and I invite my family in to see this thing, right? This marvel, this C colon blinking. And no one cared. And I just thought it was this marvel. And I remember my mom saying, "How much did you pay for this?" And I told her $600. And she couldn't have been any more irate. And I sat there, and she didn't talk to me for an entire week because I had bought this thing. She was just so flabbergasted, throwing this money out the window. And in that week, I can remember I was cleaning this thing off. I was deleting things, and I ended up deleting the command.com file. So the computer wouldn't even boot. And so I had to call the guy who I bought it from and ask him how to get the computer going again. And he told me, and he told me which disk he had given me that had it on there from DOS and all the rest of this stuff. So I got the computer restored. And I can remember my mom, like the first things out of her mouth after she decided she was going to talk to me again, she's like, "Hey, these computers, they're a fad. It's a passing thing. They're not going to be around for long. It's, all this stuff." And it was like, oh, well, that's the Jim Henson experience, right? Like I could have taken that pressure and folded, yet I continued on. And that has been part of the story. That's where my journey with computers, data, numbers, all of that began. And to think that, my mom was so vehemently against it, I can only imagine what she thinks of AI and all the things for today. Those must be fads too. So anyway, that 600 has always stuck with me. That was that first time I took a chunk and wrote the check out and gave that to somebody. It just seems, there's no Venmo, there's none of those things, but to sign that kind of money away. So
Yeah.
that's a number that has always stuck with me and been, very important to kind of my trajectory.
That's great. What year was that, Tom? Do you remember?
So it was like late 1992, I'm guessing, because I would have been like a junior in high school. So that would have been the right time. So it was like an 83 or something like that computer or something.
Yeah. I thought the year, that number was relevant too. I just thought in 2025, what parent allows a kid to sort of bring in an unknown appliance into their house and just sort of set it up unaware of what it can do and what its
Right.
capacity is. So I just thought 1992 is an important number in that story too, because those things
Yeah.
don't happen the same way as they do today.
Well, and you don't just take your kid to unknown people's houses and let them just go inside. And, I mean, the world is completely different. Yeah.
Right. Although you do put your
Fascinating.
kid in an Uber with a stranger and tell the Uber driver to take them to the baseball game, right? So
That would have been easier than having to gauge my dad, though. That's a great point.
right. Yeah. Well, that's great. Excellent number.
Yeah.
The number I'm choosing, it's a number that every single time it comes up, I think of the same thing. So in about the same year, actually, right around 1992, I get arrested for a crime I did not commit. I'm managing a McDonald's restaurant in Massachusetts on Cape Cod, and a deposit goes missing, $7,000. And I am responsible for the deposit. 2 deposits made it to the bank, the third one didn't. I probably lost the deposit. I put all 3 on my roof sort of unlocked the door, because in 1992 you couldn't sort of beep beep your door open, and because the car had a rack, or like a roof rack on the top, I think probably what happened was one of those deposits sort of fell into the roof rack and I didn't see it, and when I drove away probably landed on the ground, and someone had a $7,000 prize they weren't expecting. And although McDonald's didn't think I had stolen the money, we had to report the loss for insurance purposes. And I ran into a police officer who thought I did take the money.
Right.
And so after a series of interrogations, I ended up getting arrested. And the police charged me on behalf of the insurance company that we were claiming insurance for. I went to jail. I eventually got arraigned. I eventually got out of jail. And then the next 18 months of my life were very, very difficult. I
Oh, I
couldn't get
can
a
imagine.
job. I became homeless for a period of time. I got rescued off the streets by a family of Jehovah's Witnesses who I happen to know, former employees who I hired in another McDonald's. They gave me a pantry off their kitchen that had been converted into a room for their pet goat. They had an indoor goat, and so I shared that room with their goat for 18 months while I waited for my trial. I had to pay $10,000 for an attorney, which in 1992 was $1 billion essentially.
Yeah, that's
And
real
so,
money.
yeah, and I got two jobs. I went to work at a McDonald's, an owner operator who believed in me. The company fired me, but the owner operator hired me. And oddly, I got a job at a bank. I became a teller and then an assistant manager, because on an employment application, you don't have to mention if you're arrested. You have to mention if you're convicted of a crime.
Oh, yeah.
And so they didn't know that I was awaiting trial, and they would actually testify against me, the bank, because the bank that I was working for was the bank I was supposed to drop the money in. And so they actually ended up in the courtroom testifying against me, then realizing I was an employee. And that was the first moment that that connection was made.
Wow.
But it was a difficult time for me for a lot of reasons, the most difficult 18 months of my life. And when my trial finally came around, I had an attorney. I hired a good one. He ultimately became a Supreme Court justice in Massachusetts years and years later. But I knew I wanted to be an elementary school teacher more than anything. And if I had been convicted of a felony, I would not have been able to be a teacher ever in my life. So I went out and hired someone and worked, you know, two full-time jobs for 18 months, basically sleeping and working and doing nothing else in order to pay him off. And on the day of the trial, I was sitting next to him, and we took a trial with a judge. The way it works, or at least the way it worked back then, was you could have a trial with a judge, and if the judge found you guilty, you can then request a jury trial. So you get two shots at the apple, essentially. So my attorney said, "We'll take the judge trial. We'll see how it goes." And it wasn't going well. I could tell right off the bat that it was not going well. At one point, I remember the judge said, "I don't understand this. You work for McDonald's and the bank, and they're both here to testify against you." And I said, "Well, I guess they don't think I'm guilty, Your Honor." And my attorney kicked me under the table and said, "Shut up. You don't speak unless you're spoken to." Uh, so I could tell it was sort of not going well. It just seemed like I'm responsible for the money, and the money disappeared. And the sticking point was the police I had done with the money. That they had asked me a million times if I had sold drugs, and I have never actually used an illegal drug in my life. I got kicked out of my home when I was 17, and I decided I should never use a drug because I have no safety net. So I purposefully was as clean as a whistle. So they couldn't really place the $7,000 in my life. I didn't have anything new. So they just figured I'm sitting on the money and hiding it somewhere. But when it came time for us to testify, or for our side of the case to be presented, my attorney took a piece of paper that I had not seen yet. And he said, "Your Honor, this is a list of all the people that went in the safe at McDonald's the day that the deposit disappeared." Because although we had to do the combination, we also had an electronic key you had to slide into the safe.
Mm.
And so the safe had been opened 42 times that day by 8 different people, including me. And so the judge looked at the piece of paper, and without my attorney almost saying anything, the judge said, "Well, it looks like any one of 8 people had 42 opportunities to steal this money. So I'm not sure why we think this young man is the one who took it."
Wow.
And then the judge said, "I probably think you did take it, young man, but because there are 42 other opportunities for people to take the money, I'm going to declare you not guilty." And so that number 42, every single time I have seen it in my life, it takes me back to a courtroom when I get found not guilty for a crime I did not commit. And thankfully, what cost me $10,000 my attorney spent about 4 minutes sort of fighting for me simply by knowing what piece of paper to enter into evidence. And that was essentially the end of the trial. So 42 is a very important number for me. And I think I always think about is how often random numbers change the world. How just a sequence of a date landing on a certain moment, or, a certain code or a certain amount of money, just these odd numbers seem to change people's lives in really significant ways, and you don't see it coming. I didn't see the number 42 being an important part of my life. And now for the last 30 years of my life, essentially, it is one of the most important numbers in my life. It's the number that set me free.
Well, and that's such an amazing story. Like, let's take a minute and and acknowledge that. But it's so amazing that the reason 42 sticks with you is because the story is so
Right.
sticky, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I think that's if there is a poster child for what we're trying to get across, that's it, right? I mean, that's why, you can't just say 42 or 600. You've got to give that context. And now everybody who's going to think about this is going to think about 18 months with a goat, 42, opportunities and those sorts of things. And that's the power. And I think, before we wrap up this episode, I think it would be awesome to talk a little bit about your concept of homework for life. Cause I think about it in terms of, because like this 42, I wonder if you go back and look at other things in your life, has that shown up in other places? Like, did the lawyer actually spend like 42 minutes, putting all that together versus 4? There may be reoccurrences of that, for me, particular 600, as every time I see that, there's some significance to it as well. But I just take a couple minutes and talk about the homework for life concept and capturing some of this stuff, because I think that's where a lot of these stories come from, and you can use it in business as much as you do in life, because I mean, numbers present themselves in all of these arenas.
Yeah, for sure. So Homework for Life was my attempt to find more stories because I perform on stages all the time and I was worried I'd run out of stories. And so basically, because I'm an elementary school teacher, I try to solve problems with homework. So I gave myself this homework assignment about 15 years ago. I don't want people to think of it as journaling because that sounds like a chore. And if you're journaling, you can skip days. And the purpose of Homework for Life is you never skip a day. And so basically, at the end of every day, I ask myself, what's the most story-worthy moment that happened over the course of this day, even if nothing really important happened? The real prompt I give myself is, if someone kidnapped my family and they won't give them back to me until I tell a story about something that took place on this day, what would that story be? And now that I work with the hostage negotiation unit at the FBI, it oddly feels right that someone's kidnapping my family in my story. But that's the goal. And then I don't write the whole story down. I use a spreadsheet, essentially 2 columns, a date on one side, and I stretch the B column across the screen. And it's in that B column that I allow myself to write the story. I think it's important that you don't write very much because I want it to be like brushing your teeth. It's just a simple habit that takes 5 minutes a day. In the beginning, I was hoping to find one moment per day, maybe 12 new stories per year, and that would have been great. But today I average 7.8 moments per day. And that's not just me, like lots of people who do Homework for Life. It changes the way you see your life. Suddenly you see import that you didn't see before. People say things that mean things and you see the world differently. You change your mind in a significant way.
Right.
But even if you don't want to tell stories, I always say this, Tom, like if I asked you to recall as many days as possible from 2017, right? If you're really good, you might remember 50 days, maybe, right? And
Right.
that's if you're really, really good.
Right.
So when people tell me time flies, I always think that's crazy. Just go to a prison and ask an incarcerated person if time flies. It does
Right.
not, right?
Right.
What happens is we take 365, which is the length of a year, and we reduce it to 50 days if we can remember 50. And then we say 2017 flew by. It didn't,
Right.
right? We only remember 50 of them. So we've taken 365 and reduced it to 50. Homework for Life says every single day is worth remembering. If it's worth living, it's worth remembering. So find something that you can hold on to. And eventually you get good enough that you can find 7.8 things per day. So even if you don't plan on telling stories, and I think you should, particularly about numbers and data, if this is the business you're in,
Yeah.
you said it right. Like, no one's going to see the number 42 for a long time without thinking about me. That's the power of a story, right? No one's going to
Yeah.
see the number 600 without thinking about you for a while. That's the power of it.
Right.
But we want to do it too because we want to hold on to our days. We want to slow down our time. We want to be able to look back and actually see the things we've done, as opposed to looking back like so many people do and think, where did the time go? It didn't go anywhere. You just dropped it on the ground and walked away.
Right. Well, and you said something else that's really, I think, really important for people to hold on to as well. And that's the process of like just doing a podcast or anything like that on a weekly basis or whatever. You're practicing, it's at bats. So when you said you went from hoping to get one per day to 7.8, like that's because now you're in the process of noticing those things.
Yeah.
And it's just like, that's what we're hoping with doing this. That's part of the usefulness of trying to bring this notion of numbers and data to light, is like, now when you see this stuff, it's like, oh, what is the story behind that? How can I make that sticky? And I think what you're bringing up is that, the more you're attuned to these things, the more it happens. And that's when things start to slow down, because now you're capturing, you're in the noticing business. And that's really what numbers and data are about. They're patterns, right? You're looking for those things, being a noticer of those. And I think that's where the power is. And so I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that homework for life, whether you're in business or personal or both, is powerful, because then you're able to remember, oh, this is that QA incident that happened at the manufacturing facility that tells me more, or gives me more color about this data on this chart. You've got those stories.
Yeah, for sure. You can't tell a story about data unless you have stories to tell, and so when you can actually find a story in the world or in your life and apply it to the data and bring meaning to it, I think everything changes. So I totally agree. Yeah.
Great episode, Matthew. Thank you for playing along today. This has been great. Look forward to the next one.
I hope our listeners will find a number in their life and maybe share it with someone too, or
leave it in the comments for our show. And it'd be great to hear other people's numbers, dates, highway, signs or numbers, highway numbers, whatever it is. It's be fascinating to hear it.
Yeah. All right. Great.
All right. Thank you. You've reached the end of the show. We ask that if you found this useful, that you please tell a friend. Leave us a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. And if you're watching us via YouTube, please like and subscribe.